Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, Steve and I are actually kind of doing different things. Although we are both doing best of lists, Steve is doing a best of list on a subject that probably only he can do. And I am doing a best of list on a subject that Steve would never want to do because he's not a big fan of what I'm talking about today, which is insane because I'm talking about the greatest comic book company that ever existed, EC Comics. EC Comics, who back in the early 1950s produced some of the greatest comic book stories that ever existed. They did the great horror comic books and science fiction comic books and crime comic books and a bunch of other stuff, war comic books. I mean, they did all sorts of comic book stories, and they just did amazing stuff. They were recognized as being the greatest, and everybody else was trying to imitate EC Comics when they were at their height. Eventually, due to censorship and hysteria, people blaming everything on comic books. You know, back in the day, you know how people are. You know, they want to blame everything that goes wrong in society on easy stuff, easy targets, like video games or violent movies or Dungeons and Dragons at one time, or comic books. And this is back in the days when everything was blamed on comic books. So EC Comics only existed for a brief time, but they were wonderful. And I am bringing you today the 10 greatest EC comic book stories of all time, which is tough because they did so many wonderful stories that it's hard to choose 10. So I got help. I broke out 10 best of volumes. And some of these volumes, a lot of the stories are repeated in all three of them because they're such great stories. So that was a big help. The first volume is this one. This is, first of all, look at these magnificent end papers there. That's beautiful. This was published in 1971. And this is Horror Comics of the 1950s. And at the top there, we see the Old Witch and the Vault Keeper and the Crypt Keeper from, you know, Tales from the Crypt, the Vault of Horror, and the Haunt of Fear, the three horror comic books that EC Comics did. And this is full of horror comics, but it also has some stories that were in some other comics, some science fiction stories and some suspense stories, that kind of thing. And so a lot of the stories are in this volume. It's a beautiful book from back in 1971. It belonged to my stepfather and I stole it. It used to have a really nice dust jacket at one time, but that vanished so long ago, I don't even know what happened to it. I was a little kid. This is a much newer volume. This was published by Dark Horse Comics, and it's probably the closest we'll ever get to an EC Comics omnibus. It's of a very generous size. This is Choke Gasp, a selection of hand-picked EC Comics. The best of 75 years of EC Comics, although all the stories in here are from the early 50s. But it's beautiful. There's some Al Feldstein work. And Feldstein, he drew a lot of comics, but unfortunately, in choosing the comic stories, I only had 10. So a couple of my favorite artists are not represented. And one would be Feldstein. He did some great stuff. And another artist would be Johnny Craig. Surprisingly enough, Johnny Craig did wonderful work. But I don't seem to have any Johnny Craig stories chosen today, which is unfortunately. Someday I'm going to do a whole video on Johnny Craig because he was amazing. That's some example of Johnny Craig's work. He was like the main artist on the Vault of Horror, though of course he worked on all three comic books. horror comic books, and he just did wonderful, wonderful work. I love Johnny Craig. So I'm going to talk about him in his own video at some point. Now, the third book that helped me choose these stories is this one. This is the best of EC Comics, Artisan Edition. This one's pretty cool because it takes stories from the original artwork, the original art boards. And so you have all of the extra stuff that you never saw because it was, taken out in the published edition. All black and white stories as they were originally produced. And just some of the artwork that was in these EC comic book stories was just dynamite. And this is a really interesting way to read them because, it's really cool to read it from the original boards with all of the little publishing marks and everything. It's cool stuff. So this one also helped. So let's get right to it. What are the 10 greatest EC Comics stories of all time? Get right to it. We're 6 minutes in. So number 10. Number 10 is Caymans Calamity. It was illustrated by Al Feldstein, and the artist by Jack Cayman. Now, Feldstein was the editor of EC Comics, and he also was the main writer. And he's over there on the right, and on the left with the glasses is Bill Gaines, who was the publisher of EC Comics. And this story from the Den of Iniquity is Caymans Calamity, all about Jack Cayman, who illustrates the story. So this story tells the tale of how Jack Cayman was hired by EC Comics. And I chose this story, first of all, because it's hilarious, but also because it points out something that was special about EC Comics. Now, this is the early 50s, and very often in the early 50s, you never knew who the artist was on a comic book story that you might be reading. Very often, artists and writers were not credited at all in stories at that time. But EC Comics made a point of letting you know who wrote and who drew the comic books. Feldstein wrote pretty much everything, Bill Gaines and Feldstein, but so many great artists. And you knew who they were. And it was special. It was a special comic book company because of that. You knew who all these artists were. Their styles were all very, very distinctive. And it didn't take long before you knew exactly who drew the stories, even if, you didn't read who drew them. You could tell just at a glance who drew what. And Jack Cayman was interesting because he came to do horror comic books, but as is pointed out in this story, his style was perhaps ill-suited for horror comics because, as they mentioned in this story, all his characters are just so charming and beautiful. And in this story, they're like, hey, man, you've got to start writing horrible-looking stuff, And they break out this page where you meet some other artists from EC Comics. There's Johnny Craig there. You've got Jack Davis. And over here you have Ghastly Graham Ingalls. And basically, they're like, hey, man, you've got to draw like these guys. You've got to draw terrifying stuff. And so Jack Cayman's like, you're right. And so in the process of trying to draw horrible-looking comic books, he goes insane, Jack Cayman does, and becomes a horrible murderer under the full moon. It's awesome, and it's hilarious. I had to choose that one because I love it. It's actually the only place you'll find that story out of these three is in this volume from 1971. It should have been in this one. Each artist has their own section, including Cayman, and so it's bizarre to me that they didn't choose that story. Oh well, what do you do? Let's get to the next story. I think I lost it. My little bookmark disappeared. but I found it anyway. Okay. The next story is A Sound of Thunder. A Sound of Thunder, which of course was written by Ray Bradbury. It was adapted by Al Feldstein, and the art is by Al Williamson, who was just a magnificent comic book illustrator. And he did a great job on these science fiction comic books. I mean, he was just amazing. And The Sound of Thunder, which is one of Ray Bradbury's most famous stories, is just adapted beautifully here. Ray Bradbury and Feldstein became pretty good friends. And Ray Bradbury had a number of stories adapted in EC Comics. He was a big fan of the science fiction comics. The science fiction comics from EC are my favorite. Weird fantasy and weird science. Just great comics. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful version of The Sound of Thunder. So, number 8. Let me find it. It's in this other book. This is a brilliant system I came up with here, which doesn't work too well in practice, but I'll find it. I'll find number 8. Here it is, number 8. Tainted Meat, It's the Humanity. This is a story by Al Feldstein, and the art is by Jack Davis, who is a fantastic artist. He went on to do a lot of work for Mad Magazine. When EC Comics folded due to censorship, Mad Magazine survived, and Jack Davis worked at Mad Magazine for years and years. But he did some just wonderful horror comics. And this is a very ghastly, gruesome story, which really is EC Comics at its best, about this butcher. And it's during wartime, so it's hard to get meat. And so he works out a deal to sell tainted meat. He sells tainted meat to his customers without them knowing, which has the expected grisly results. And unfortunately, I don't want to spoil this story because I'm hoping that you'll go out and you'll find this stuff and you'll read this stuff. But it has a really ghastly ending involving, you know, dismembered body parts, as you would expect in an EC story. Tainted Meat, It's the Humanity. Wonderful. It was a wonderful story. And so that's at number 8. Number 7 is really an interesting story. Number 7 is a story called Midnight Mess. Midnight Mess. And this story is illustrated by Joe Orlando. Of course, Feldstein wrote the story, but it's illustrated by Joe Orlando, who just does such a wonderful, moody job with this story about this stranger who enters this town. And everything at first seems normal, but pretty quickly he notices that something's really strange about this town. Something's very unusual and pretty horrible. And so he finds out that he's in a town full of vampires. And this is the greatest panel of all. He goes to a restaurant, which is a vampire restaurant. And this woman says, "This restaurant serves blood dishes, like a vegetarian restaurant serves vegetable dishes. Blood juice cocktail, hot blood consomme, roast blood clots, French fried scabs, and blood sherbet." It's wonderful. And choke. There's a, you know, that's the reaction that you would have. And of course, the vampires all grab him and things just go to hell. It's a wonderful story. And it was adapted into, they made 2 films back in the 70s, Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror. And I think this story was adapted into one of those films. And it should have been, because it's magnificent. So that's number 7. Let's break out number 6. which is based on another Ray Bradbury story. This is Mars is Heaven. Mars is Heaven. But this one is illustrated by the great Wally Wood. So this is one of the stories that Ray Bradbury put into the Martian Chronicles. And it's just a beautiful story. Beautifully done story, I should say. It has a ghastly ending about these astronauts that go to Mars and find a lot of familiar things. They find relatives and all of these people that they knew and all of these very Earth-like buildings. I mean, everything looks like Earth that they left behind. And it's strange. So is Mars heaven? Of course not. There is a ghastly, horrible secret that the Martians are keeping, and you find out in this story. Wonderful Ray Bradbury story, probably my favorite story from the Martian Chronicles, and beautifully done here by EC Comics. So that's number 7. Excuse me, that's number 6. Number 5 is a particularly horrible story, or horrifying story, I should say. It was published in Shock Suspense Stories. Shock Suspense Stories was probably the most horrifying comic that EC Comics did. It pulled no punches, Shock Suspense Stories, and this one is called Carrion Death. Carrion Death, it was written by Bill Gaines and Al Feldstein. Gaines helped with the plot. Feldstein wrote the script. It's illustrated by Reed Crandall, who was a wonderful artist. And in this story, a criminal is pulled over by a police officer, and he's handcuffed by the police officer, but he strangles the police officer. But he's already handcuffed to him, and he can't find the keys. So he has to escape with this body attached to him, and he goes off into the desert. And the results are not great because vultures are stalking him. You know, the vultures know that he's going to die. So, you know, they're just hovering above him at all times. It's a wonderful, grisly, horrifying story with a particularly grotesque ending. It's wonderful. Carrion Death, man. EC Comics at its best, for sure. Number 4 is From the Haunt of Fear, and it's illustrated by Graham Ingalls. Horror We. How's Bayou? It's ghastly Graham Ingalls, and this is absolutely terrifying rendition of the Old Witch. Now, this is a story that takes place in the swamp. It's about this creepy dude, and his brother is insane and likes to murder people. So in order to keep his brother from killing him, he will lure unwary strangers to his place, and his brother will murder them. His brother will murder the strangers. And it's very ghastly. Graham Ingalls was an amazing illustrator. Everything he drew just looked creepy. And so he gained the name Ghastly Graham Ingalls, which he was proud of for a while. Later in life, he decided to reject his past. And I don't know if he was ashamed of the horror comic books that he did or what his deal was. But Graham Ingalls in later life decided to disassociate himself from the horror comics that he wrote, which is unfortunate because it was amazing stuff. He was one of the greatest artists in this company. And he just did terrifying story after terrifying story. It was great. And so, of course, in the grand EC Comics tradition, that guy who lured people to their deaths, he came to a bad end. He came to a bad end. And that's a great story. Number 3, another story from Shock Suspense Stories. Now, EC Comics was actually a pretty progressive company. They wrote some pretty progressive stories. And when I was younger, back in the 1980s, a lot of older people would reminisce and be nostalgic for the 1950s in the same way that old people like me are nostalgic for the 1980s. But the 1950s was kind of a horrible time in a lot of ways. There was so much social injustice and terrible things happening and prejudice. And this story, A Kind of Justice, puts a glaring light on a lot of those things. First of all, this story, A Kind of Justice, is about sexual assault, for one thing. It's also about police corruption and police brutality. It's also about mob justice. So there are a lot of issues that are being tackled in this very adult story. And it's just done wonderfully. The writer of this is actually Carl Wessler, and the art is Reed Crandall again. And he just does a wonderful job with this story. And it is probably, to me, the scariest story that EC Comics ever did, because the story is based on real stuff that happened in the 1950s. I mean, these are the kinds of things that could happen. And so, it's an absolutely terrifying story and beautifully done, just beautifully done. So yeah, A Kind of Justice, that probably deserves a video all on its own because it's just so well done. Number 2, one of my favorite stories of all time. This was another story written by Feldstein and art by Jack Davis. This is Foul Play. Foul Play. This is one of the most notorious of all EC Comics stories, where we have this wretched baseball player who is not only a cheat, but he's a killer cheat. And because of him, this ball player is killed. And so this baseball team wants to get revenge on this player who killed their teammate. And they do it in particularly ghastly fashion. And it's illustrated just beautifully by Jack Davis. And it is notorious because of how they get their revenge. And I'm going to spoil the ending on this one. They get their revenge by taking this guy, cutting him up into little bits, and at the end, they play baseball with his body parts. They use his head as the ball, they use his leg as the bat. They've got guts stretched in between the bases. Internal organs are sitting there on the bases. It's great. And so, yeah, I'll happily spoil the ending to that story because it's just as, you'll enjoy it just as much if you ever get to it. It's wonderful, Foul Play, and it's kind of legendary, that story. Number 1. Took me a minute to find number 1. Number 1 was published in a comic book called Impact. And Impact was one of the comics that was produced after all of EC Comics' horror comic books were shut down because of censorship and public outrage and nonsense. But in this comic book Impact, which did not last very long, none of the comic books that EC tried to do after the horror comic books were shut down lasted all that long. In this comic book was published a story called Master Race, which was plotted by Bill Gaines and Feldstein, and Feldstein wrote the story. And the artist is Bernard Krigstein, and he just does a wonderful job with this story. It's 8 pages long, and it's a masterpiece. It is so skillfully done. It's a story about this commander of a prison camp, of a concentration camp. And after the war, he is on a train, and he's recognized by one of the inmates of that camp, a Holocaust survivor. And it's just such a skillfully told story. It is just so well done. And it has proven to be one of the most influential pieces of comic book art that's ever been created. It is probably one of the best comic book stories that's ever been produced. It's just amazing. And it had to be number one on this list. I mean, it's one of the stories from EC Comics that has become kind of legendary among people who love comic books. It is just so well done. So Master Race had to be number one. It's just a beautiful piece of work. So there you go, EC Comics. So EC Comics nowadays are being reprinted by Dark Horse. There are many volumes of EC Comics that are available, many collections of EC Comics. And I'm reading through them right now because I've read a lot of EC Comics, but I've never read them all. And so I'm doing that at the moment, and they're just fantastic. So EC Comics and the 10 greatest EC Comics. Perhaps you have a favorite EC comic that wasn't in this list. There are a lot, and your choice would probably be just as valid as any of these because they did so many great comic book stories that it's pretty tough to choose 10 best. They just did so many great stories. That's all I have to say today. I will catch you next time.